Since the beginning of time, humans have been obsessed with land. In the Bible, you weren't truly rich unless you had goats, vineyards, or at least a field to plant onions. Fast forward to 2025, and land is still the hot topic, except now, instead of Jacob and Esau fighting over birthrights, it's politicians, farmers, and ordinary South Africans fighting over title deeds and expropriation without compensation. So as to who really owns the land in South Africa? Will giving land back solve poverty? Or do South Africans just need jobs, cash, and maybe a working Eskom before we worry about fields of maize? Let's dig in. All right, before we get lost in today's heated debates about land, expropriation, and politics, let's rewind the clock, because land ownership didn't start with politicians shouting in Parliament. Nope, it started way back, in the Bible. In biblical times, land wasn't just soil. It was inheritance, it was blessing, it was identity. If you didn't have land, you were basically a nobody. You could sell your goats, trade your cows, even marry off your daughters. But the land? That stayed in the family. Title deeds were sacred. The land was like that old cast-iron pot your grandmother refuses to throw away. It passed down generation to generation. Now let's leave the Bible for now and move to Africa, pre-colonial days. Here's the interesting part. In most African societies, nobody really owned land in the way we think about it today. Land was communal. The chief or king acted more like a caretaker than an owner. You wanted to farm? The chief said, "Sure, here's a piece of land, go plant your maize." When you were done, the land went back into the pool for someone else to use. It was practical, flexible, and let's be honest, there were no lawyers charging you 3,000 rands an hour to stamp your title deed. But then, enter the Europeans. And with them came three deadly weapons: guns, maps, and lawyers. The guns took the land, the maps drew the borders, and the lawyers made sure everything looked legal on paper. Suddenly, this land that Africans had been using communally for centuries now required paperwork, surveys, and signatures Africans had never seen before. Imagine trying to explain to a Zulu chief in the 1700s that his cattle grazing field now belongs to Lord Van Rensburg because of a piece of paper signed in London. That's like someone stealing your Wi-Fi just because they printed the password on fancy letterhead. And this wasn't just theory, it became law. By 1913, South Africa passed its first Land Act. What did it do? Well, it basically said, sorry, black South Africans, you can only live on 7% of the land. The rest, 87%, is reserved for white South Africans, 7%, for the majority of the population. Later, that was expanded to 13%. But still 87% of all land was in white hands. This law wasn't just about farming, it was about control. It forced millions of black South Africans into reserves, into labor tenancy, and into cities to work as cheap labor. Land wasn't just about food anymore, it was about power. Okay, so now we know how land was stolen, reshaped, and legislated in South Africa's past. But here's the big question: who owns the land today? You'd think after almost 30 years of democracy, the picture would be balanced, right? Well, not quite. Let's break it down. As of 2023, South Africa's population is around 60 million people. Out of that, white South Africans make up only about 8%. But here's the twist: they still own the majority of commercial farmland. According to government stats, black South Africans' land ownership is somewhere between 20–25% depending on how you measure it. That's a big jump from the 1913 Land Act days, but still far from reflecting the country's demographics. Now the government has tried. Since 1994, they claim to have transferred about 9 million hectares of land back to black South Africans. Sounds impressive, right? That's almost the size of Portugal. But here's the catch: more than half of that land is either lying idle or has collapsed into unproductive farming. It's like being gifted a Ferrari, but no one gives you fuel money, insurance, or driving lessons. Sure, it looks good on paper, but in real life it's just a shiny lawn ornament. One of the biggest obstacles? Title deeds. Most redistributed land isn't actually transferred into private ownership. Instead, it stays state-owned and people get long-term leases. That might sound fine, but here's the problem. If you don't have a title deed in your name, you can't use the land as collateral. That means no bank loans. And if you can't get loans, you can't buy seeds, tractors, or irrigation equipment. So what happens? Farms stagnate, productivity drops, and the cycle of poverty continues. It's like being given a house but told, oh, by the way, you're not allowed to renovate, sell, or take out a bond on it. Just live in it and hope the roof doesn't collapse. Then there's corruption. And oh boy, do we have corruption. In many cases, redistributed land doesn't even go to small farmers or rural communities. It goes to politically connected elites. You'll hear stories of government officials or their friends getting prime farmland, while ordinary South Africans wait for years on waiting lists. Some farms are handed to people with zero interest in farming, just connections. It's the land reform equivalent of handing out RDP houses to people who already own 3 properties in Sandton. And when land does change hands, productivity often collapses. Why? Because farming isn't just about owning soil. It's about skills, infrastructure, market access, and capital. Commercial farms run by generations of experienced farmers suddenly collapse when handed to people with no support. Not because the new owners are incapable, but because they're not given the training, funding, or mentorship needed. Think about it. You don't hand someone the keys to an airplane and say, congrats, you're a pilot now. Good luck landing in OR Tambo International. But that's basically what happens with land reform. And the results? South Africa has gone from being a food exporter in some commodities to struggling with rising imports. Food security, yes, your maize meal, your bread, your braai meat, depends heavily on whether we get land reform right. So here's where we are today. A small minority still owns most of the best farmland. The majority is still waiting. Government transfers look good on paper, but are riddled with inefficiencies, corruption, and lack of support. And the gap between owning land and successfully farming land remains massive. Land reform, as many agree, was supposed to heal centuries of dispossession. Instead, it often feels like a political football, kicked around every election season, with very little real progress made. So to sum it up, the land situation today is like a badly shared pizza. One guy with 8% of the appetite has eaten most of the slices. The other 92% are left fighting over crusts, and the government keeps promising more pizza deliveries that never seem to arrive. And even when a new slice does get handed over, it often comes without the cheese, the oven, or even the plate. Just dough. Which begs the next question. Can expropriation without compensation fix all this, or will it just burn the whole pizza? Okay, let's move to the spiciest part of the land debate, the phrase that makes investors sweat, farmers panic, and politicians grin from ear to ear: expropriation without compensation. Now let's break that down. What does it mean? In simple terms, it's when government can seize land and redistribute it without paying the current owner. Supporters say, it's justice, why should we pay for land that was stolen in the first place? Critics say, this will tank the economy faster than Eskom can switch off the lights. So who's right? Let's dig deeper. Supporters argue that land reform has been way too slow. Since 1994, South Africa promised to transfer 30% of land to black South Africans. 3 decades later, we're not even halfway there. The willing buyer, willing seller model has failed. Landowners demand huge prices, government drags its feet, and ordinary people are still landless. From this angle, expropriation without compensation looks like the turbo button, a way to accelerate justice. After all, if land was taken through colonialism and apartheid, why must taxpayers now buy it back? It's like being robbed of your own car, and then the thief offers to sell it back to you. Justice or scam of the century? Critics, on the other hand, say, whoa, slow down, this is dangerous. Why? Because expropriation without compensation messes with the heart of the economy: property rights. Investors rely on secure property rights before putting money into farms, factories, or housing. If government can take land today without paying, what's next? Shopping malls? Factories? Your grandmother's tea set? The fear is that once property rights are weakened, confidence evaporates. Banks stop lending, farmers stop producing, businesses start packing, and the economy nosedives. And these fears aren't just paranoia. South Africa's northern neighbor, Zimbabwe, tried fast-track land reform in the year 2000. White-owned farms were seized overnight, often violently. The intention? Justice. The reality? Chaos. Commercial farming collapsed. Food production dropped by 60%. Zimbabwe, once nicknamed the breadbasket of Africa, became the basket case. Hyperinflation spiraled so badly, people carried sacks of money to buy bread. Imagine paying 1 billion Zimbabwe dollars for a loaf of bread. That's not food, it's a collector's item. Now let's look at Namibia. They chose the opposite strategy, the slow lane. Land reform there was based on a willing buyer, willing seller approach, where government buys farms at market prices and redistributes them. The result? Progress has been painfully slow. Decades later, land ownership is still unequal, frustration is rising, and many Namibians feel betrayed. So Namibia shows us that too slow doesn't work. Zimbabwe shows us that too fast doesn't work. And South Africa? Stuck somewhere in the middle, asking, how do we speed things up without crashing the tractor? In South Africa, the debate has been raging for years. The ANC pushed for a constitutional amendment to allow expropriation without compensation. Heated debates filled Parliament, lots of shouting, table banging, and more drama than a Generations episode. But even after all that, progress is slow. Courts step in, investors threaten to leave, and the real beneficiaries, ordinary South Africans, are still left waiting. Here's why expropriation without compensation is such a tricky gamble. Investor panic. When property rights look shaky, investors pull out. That means less money in the economy, fewer jobs, weaker currency. Food security. If commercial farmers fear losing their land, they stop investing. Production drops, prices rise. Who suffers? Ordinary South Africans at Checkers. Legal gridlock. Every case of land seizure could end up in court. South Africa's courts are already overloaded. Now imagine thousands of land disputes clogging the system. Productivity collapse. If land is seized without proper support, we risk repeating Zimbabwe's mistake. Fields that once produced food turning into empty, overgrown plots. Honestly, expropriation without compensation sounds exciting, like a blockbuster action movie. But in reality, it's more like a badly written soap opera. Lots of drama, everyone shouting and nobody getting the happy ending. It could be justice, yes, but without careful planning, support and balance, it could also turn into the most expensive soap opera in South African history, costing jobs, food, and economic stability. All right, so far we've been talking about hectares, title deeds, and tractors. But let's pause and ask a very uncomfortable question. Do South Africans really need land to escape poverty, or do they actually need something else, like jobs, money, or maybe just working Wi-Fi? Because here's the truth. Not everyone dreams of being a farmer. In fact, a lot of young South Africans would rather own a MacBook or be a TikTok influencer than a maize field. Here's the reality. South Africa is now a majority urban country. Over 2/3 of people live in towns and cities. For many young people, farming feels about as exciting as dial-up internet. Ask a 22-year-old in Soweto if they want a 50-hectare farm in Limpopo. They'll probably say farm. Do you mean Farmville, the Facebook game? That's the generational gap. For many, land reform talks about plows and cattle, while their dream is coding, DJing, or becoming a TikTok influencer. And it's not just South Africa. Around the world, we've seen this same tension. The World Bank and other researchers show that giving land can reduce inequality, but only if it's paired with skills, investment, and access to markets. Land by itself doesn't guarantee poverty reduction. Think about it this way. If you give me 10 hectares of land tomorrow, guess what I'll produce? Dead plants. Because I don't know how to farm, I don't have equipment, and Woolworths isn't buying my shriveled spinach. Land without support is like giving someone a laptop with no Wi-Fi. Sure, they own it, but what's the point? This brings us to another huge issue. Urban land. Millions of South Africans don't want farms, they want housing. They want land in cities to build homes, send kids to school, and live close to work. South Africa has one of the world's highest rates of informal settlements, whole communities living on borrowed ground with no security. So when we say land reform, we can't only think of giant fields of maize in Mpumalanga. We also need to think of tiny plots in Johannesburg, Durban, and Cape Town. Sometimes dignity doesn't come from owning a tractor. It comes from owning a backyard where you can braai without the municipality chasing you away. So land or jobs? Here's what I think is the brutal truth. Jobs matter more. Without jobs, Land ownership risks becoming symbolic. You can own hectares, but if you have no income, no training, and no infrastructure, you're just poor, but on a bigger piece of ground. And here's the scary part. Studies show South Africa's unemployment crisis is the real killer. Nearly 1 in 3 adults can't find work. Among the youth, unemployment is over 50%. That's not just an economic problem, it's a ticking time bomb. So while land reform is important for justice and dignity, jobs are what actually keep people alive. A payslip often feeds families more reliably than a patch of soil. But don't get me wrong, this isn't an either-or. Land reform is still crucial for healing history and giving people opportunities. But land must come with support, jobs, and training. The formula is, land plus jobs plus education plus infrastructure is equal to real empowerment. Leave one part out, and the whole system fails. It's like making a maguinho or vetkoeks. If you forget the flour, all you've got is hot oil and disappointment. So when politicians scream about land reform, remember this. The real question isn't just who owns the hectares. It's also who has the jobs, the money, and the skills to use that land. Because let's be honest, if you handed most of us 100 hectares tomorrow, the only thing we'd successfully farm is debt. All right, quick twist. When we talk about land, most people picture tractors, wheat fields, and goats. But actually, the real land crisis in South Africa is urban housing. Over 2 million households live in informal settlements, shacks with no title deeds, no running water, and no security. For them, owning a small plot in the city is worth more than inheriting 100 hectares in the Karoo. Why? Because land in Johannesburg means you can build a house, start a small business, and send your kids to school nearby. Land in the middle of nowhere, that's just extra space for dust. Just imagine giving a family a farm 200 kilometers from the nearest job. That's not empowerment. That's exile with cows, and here's the catch. Urban land is controlled by municipalities, property developers, and sometimes good old-fashioned corruption. Developers buy up prime land, build luxury apartments, and the poor are told, I'm sorry, no space for you unless you can afford 40,000 rands in rates and taxes per month. Meanwhile, municipalities sit on huge chunks of land that could be released for housing but never are, because red tape or political deals or maybe just laziness. Every election season, land reform becomes the ultimate political football. Politicians shout, we'll give you land, radical redistribution is coming, crowds cheer, songs are sung, campaign posters go up. Then the election ends. And silence. Back to square one. Politicians treat land like Valentine's roses. Lots of promises, big speeches, and in the end, you still don't get any. So let's zoom out. Who really owns the land in South Africa today? Mostly. White farmers still control the majority of commercial farmland. The state owns about 20% of land, often sitting idle. A handful of politically connected elites have managed to benefit from land reform. But here's the kicker. Owning land doesn't automatically equal prosperity. Land is like a tool. If you don't have training, capital, infrastructure, and markets, it's just dirt. You can't eat dirt. You can't bank dirt. You can't send your kids to university with dirt. You need jobs, money, and skills alongside the land. Think of land reform like giving someone a brand new iPhone. If you don't include the charger, the SIM card, and the data, what you've really given them is an expensive brick. Same with land. Without title deeds, loans, training, and roads, land reform can easily turn into land deform. So what's the future of land in South Africa? It has to be a mix. Land justice, so historical wounds are healed. Housing land, so millions in shacks can live with dignity. Jobs and education, so land actually creates prosperity, not poverty. Smarter policy, so land reform doesn't tank the economy like Zimbabwe, but also doesn't stagnate forever like Namibia. Because let's be real, if we keep arguing about hectares while people can't even afford a loaf of bread, then land reform is just political theatre. So in the end, the question who really owns the land in South Africa has two answers. On paper, mostly white farmers, the state, and a few connected elites. In reality, nobody really owns it if people don't have the means to use it. Land matters, but land alone won't fix poverty. The real solution is a recipe. Land plus jobs plus education plus infrastructure is equal to empowerment. Otherwise, we'll keep fighting over land while the real wealth opportunity passes us by. And remember, if someone tries to sell you a farm but the title deed is handwritten in crayon, is run. That's not empowerment, that's just fraud with stationery. If you enjoyed this video, smash that like button before someone expropriates it without compensation. Subscribe for more deep dives, explained the in a nutshell way. Until next time, take care, and may your